Hi, welcome back. This is Andrew Sears, and in this lesson we're going to be going over an overview of instructional design models. The first model that everyone really talks about in instructional design is the ADDIE model. That stands for Analysis, Design, Develop, Implement, and Evaluate. I'm not going to go into detail on this because there's a YouTube video that is a part of this that I would highly recommend that you go through, and it explains ADDIE much better. So one thing I would explain, though, is that the layout of this course and the design of this course followed loosely ADDIE, but it also, the outline of the course is following ADDIE. So lessons 1 through 3, where you're working on the research template, those assignments are a part of the analysis phase. And then in lessons 2 through 6, we're going to be having you do components of the design phase. And then in lessons 7 and 8, you're going to be doing the development in Canvas. And in lessons 2 through 6, we're going to be using a course blueprint template. So, while ADDIE is kind of the foundation because it explains all the steps, traditional ADDIE follows what's called Waterfall project management and backward project design, and it really fits a situation. And the way Waterfall works is, you start with an audience, and in your analysis, it's often used where you're designing for traditional students. So that's very different than non-traditional students, adults. And you are doing outcomes for very well-defined fields. So the field, might change, but it's a field of business. This is an entirely new field. So then you're doing assessments based on well-known outcomes. So you can define the outcomes in advance, and you do instruction with known content available. And the challenge with the ADDIE model is really the way it was designed. It was designed for the U.S. military, and the military often doesn't move very quick, and the evaluation feedback typically happens in years, and it falls into assessment processes where things might change every 3 to 5 years, which is really too slow for today's world. So as a solution to that, there is another model called the Successive Approximation model, and I think most people follow something closer to this. And the idea is you're going to do preparing, and then you're going to go through a rapid iteration design phase. So that's this green section. And then you're going to go through an iterative development phase where you're actually trying to implement. And we, in designing this course, actually followed something closer to SAM, even though you could say we did each step in ADDIE, but the way we did our iterations was more like this. And the main advantage of this is it's more iterative, it's a lean approach, and it provides faster feedback cycles than traditional ADDIE. And again, I'm not going to go into the full detail on SAM. There's a YouTube video that explains it much better. One thing to look at is what's the best design methodology to use, and that actually changes based on the environment. So Waterfall, and I would put in that traditional ADDIE, is good whenever the problem is known. So you know what your customers want, and the field doesn't change much. And then the solution, you know how to deliver it. The tech and resources also don't change much. I often see people, they'll design a brilliant course, and they teach it over 10 years, and it was designed using technology that's 10 or 20 years old, and it's horrible because of that. So often, we need to be thinking about these things. So in software development, you have something called Agile development, and you can apply the same principles to instructional design. And there you have a known problem, but you often don't know how to solve it initially. So you might iterate on the solution. But lean startup, or some people call it lean design, you don't fully know the problem. You may not even know who your customer is going to be. You may be establishing a course for a field where this is the first version of this course. There is no textbook for it. And you may not know the best way to deliver that. So another way of showing this is in a project management mode. So Waterfall and that traditional ADDIE and assessments. You might have, like I said, what you'll do is you'll build it, and it might take, a year or two to build it, and then you'll release it, and then you'll get customer feedback. Whereas in Agile, you do a release, this might be a quick software update, and then you do, build and release, and get feedback as you go. Whereas Lean, you build, you release, and you get feedback. And designing this course, we're actually designing it with the understanding that we're probably only going to get it, less than 80% right. And we're going to be updating it as we learn from you. And really, we're following something that's called the Lean startup process, where you start with an MVP, then you measure, and you take that data and you pivot. And the key thing behind the Lean startup process is your effectiveness as a designer, or your competitive effectiveness, is that you can maximize your loop iteration speed. So now, why do I emphasize these other models so much? Well, part of it's just a passion for mine. My first course on Udemy that's had over 3,000 students was on disruptive innovation in higher education. And the challenge we were looking at is really this rapid growth of higher education globally. So higher education globally had 100 million students in 2000, and it's growing to 263 million students in 2025. So 84% of that growth is happening in the developing world, and everyone wants to expand access to higher education, but I believe that a lot of our models for doing that are broken. So some of those critiques that I had in the previous slides, I think, help address that. So ultimately, there's going to be 137 million new students in developing countries by 2025. That's largely coming from the 4.9 billion middle class globally by 2030. So another way of looking at this is, most of you have seen this project management triangle. And the idea is you can have cost, scope, and time. And I've adjusted those in this diagram to call it quality, cost, quality. And I call time the adaptive revision frequency, which really is highly correlated to the practical application. And part of the reason for that is, if you teach theory and you're teaching math, basic math isn't going to change over time, but the more you get close to application, the more quickly that content is going to change. And your priorities are going to change based on the environment. So if you look at developing countries and Western countries, so part of the idea behind the iron triangle of project management is you usually can pick two of these things to optimize for. You can't do all three. And developing countries are going to have to optimize more for cost and for practical application, or the adaptive revision frequency. Whereas Western countries will optimize much more on, the technical quality, but maybe without as much application or adaptive revision frequency. So what's needed, and looking at this number one, do you have a fixed cost design or a fixed quality design? And the way accreditation works in Western countries is you have a fixed quality design. You say you have to meet this standard, and if you don't meet this standard, then you're not going to be accredited. But there's countries like Ethiopia where the average year of higher education costs $500, and you're probably going to change your design if your cost has to be 1/100th of Western higher education. And that doesn't mean that the quality has to go down in all aspects, but some of the aspects that Westerners believe are important may not be as critical. The other thing is you need more adaptive design, especially cultural minorities with limited resources will face environments that have more unknowns. Western educators, most of the books are written for Western educators where there's more homogeneity, globally dominant culture. And if you're designing for a country that's smaller, then you're going to have to do more adaptation. And then the foundation for most materials is Western middle class audiences. The cultural contextualization is a much larger part of the definition of quality outside of Anglo or Western context. So as we think about this, how do we grow higher education globally, this becomes much more important. And ultimately, the challenge is, how do you more than double access to higher education in 20 years? And I think that a big part of it is you have to use lean startup design to design for 4 interrelated uncertainties. So, one, you have changing students. So You're going to have different students, and they may have different goals, content, and cost. So how you design a $1,000 degree is very different from how you design a $100,000 degree or a $10,000 degree, or even free courses on Udemy. So then that's going to drive, what are realistic goals given the students, the cost, and the content. Then what that's going to drive is you're going to be thinking about, okay, how do we, given the costs and the goals and the students, what sort of content can we actually do? And there's a lot of people who will provide free courses, and they have to use open content because it's free. If you charge someone textbooks, then that's not going to work. And then the radically different content availability is going to allow for radically different costs. So all those things interrelate. So that's the end of this session, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Thanks a lot.